Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Bard Graduate Center to kick off our 20th annual seminar series. The full year's poster and list may have arrived in your mailboxes yesterday, but if not, you can find it on our website. Just as a side note, the first lecture 20 years ago was held on the 13th of November, 2001, and a copy of all 10 cultural histories of the material world books published so far will go to the person who can name that first speaker. I'm Peter Miller, I'm the Dean of the Bard Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, those in the room, even more so because it's the first time we've had people in this room for a talk in the same 18 months that have left all of us in our homes mostly and in front of our screens, and those of you joining us around the world, here on West 86th Street or anywhere else. And we here acknowledge that the Bard Graduate Center's intellectual and cultural and social life unfolds on the island of Mannahatta, Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. Today's speaker is a visiting fellow this year at the Bard Graduate Center, Henry Colburn, who has taught in many institutions and held curatorial positions. He's been a curator or a fellow or a lecturer at the Harvard Art Museums, the Getty Research Institute, the University of Southern California, the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan, at Cal Riverside, and is currently at Cooper Union. His PhD is in classical art and archaeology from the University of Michigan, and he is the author very recently of Archaeology of Empire in Achaemenid Egypt, published by Edinburgh University Press just last year. And he is an expert on the art of the Achaemenids, and in particular, their position in Egypt from the 6th and 5th centuries onwards. Recently, he's published articles in the Journal of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a collective volume called The Art of Empire, Achaemenid Persia. He has published on the canon of ancient Iranian art and engaged in the question of art after Alexander, quote, from the Mediterranean to China. He is in a volume entitled The Archaeology of Imperial Landscape and the Routledge History of Archaeology and Globalization for the question of the Achaemenid Empire and globalization. It should give a sense of the range of his work and why it is that he is a Fields of the Fellow, of the Future Fellow at the Bard Graduate Center. The question of what the future is and the fields of the future is an interesting one. The title of today's talk on Parthian art as a problem suggests exactly how fields of the future are construed. There often are fields from the past that are not understood and then are revitalized with new questions. So it's very exciting to have him here in residence with us for the fall. Finally, before he comes to the podium, just a word on how today's event will run. Henry will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open things up for questions and discussion. Those in the room, feel free to use your mechanical hand to ask the questions, and those at home, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll be able to read and no doubt interpret a bit, inevitably, your questions to the speaker. We have automatic captioning, which you can turn on at home using the CC function at the bottom of your screen. We're also recording this event, and a copy of the video will be available soon on our website and YouTube channel. And after all of that, it is an even greater pleasure to turn the podium over to our speaker, Henry Colburn.
Thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here at the Bard Graduate Center. It is a real privilege and a pleasure. It is also a great pleasure to be here speaking to people in a room. which is something I have not done for a while. I am accustomed to giving talks to my cat, who is deaf, and to my dog, who is an idiot. I'm going to begin by explaining my title. And first, I will begin by explaining what a Parthian is. So, after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his empire is divided up by his generals. And one of them, Seleucus, ends up with what you see on the screen as the yellow part. This is a large piece of what was formerly the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Now, somewhat to the east of the Caspian Sea is a region called Parthia. And it is in this region that sometime early in the Seleucid Empire, that a group called the Parni, an Iranian-speaking people, migrate into this region of Parthia and set up a nice little empire for themselves. They're led by a guy called Arsaces, and this name is later taken by all of the subsequent kings of the Parthians. So we call this the Arsacid dynasty, and properly we ought to call it the Arsacid Empire, and many scholars do. I will use the term Parthian here for historical reasons that will become obvious later on, but also just because it's the more widely familiar term. The Parthians eventually carved a rather large empire out of the Seleucid Empire, which they accomplished through various means, including their expert horsemanship. In fact, the Parthians are best known for this strategy called the Parthian shot. And for your visual stimulation, I give you two illustrations of it here. On the left, we have a lead glazed bowl. This is probably made in Anatolia or Syria. And on the right, we have a somewhat sketchy but very sort of evocative depiction of what may be a Parthian shot. And you can see from these illustrations and from the text at the bottom, the Parthian shot is a strategy where you ride towards your enemy and then at the last minute turn around and ride away from him, all the while turning in the saddle and shooting arrows at him while he pursues you. The Parthians were very good at this. They used it against the Romans, and in fact, Parthian shot entered the Victorian English vocabulary as an expression referring to a remark made as one is leaving. This is probably what they are best known for. Now, they managed to conquer a fairly large region, and I like this map, both because it is brightly colored, but also because the edges of the map are fuzzy. In the study of ancient empires, we very rarely have clearly defined boundaries. And this is especially true with the Parthians. We have good reasons for thinking that they ruled these orange areas in various ways at various times. But we are often hard pressed to say exactly when or exactly how. So what is the problem with Parthian art? Well, the short answer is everything. One would think that the study of Parthian art would rest first and foremost on the dynastic art of the Arsacid kings, the material culture that they used to legitimize and promulgate their rule. Unfortunately, we don't really have any of that, at least not in a clear, unequivocal manner. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Similarly, there are questions of origins. It's difficult to pin down what the exact predecessors of Parthian art are. Its style as we'll see, is also incredibly difficult to pin down. The Rhyton I'm showing you here is an object near and dear to my heart, which is really why it's here. But it's a nice illustration of this stylistic problem in Parthian art. This is undoubtedly a Parthian drinking vessel. And yet it is in a style that many art historians would call Greek. It certainly has Greek approaches to the molding of the cat's body, the musculature, and of course the iconography is seemingly Greek as well. The panther was the preferred creature of the Greek god of wine, Dionysus. He's often shown riding it. So you can see how trying to pin down Parthian style is difficult if this is the kind of material we have. And of course, this leads to further complications in that if we cannot identify the essential elements of Parthian art, how can we study its interaction with other artistic traditions? How can we look at the way in which the Parthians impacted the people of their empires, the ways in which the people of the empire construed their identities through material culture? All of these wonderful questions that I've been able to investigate with the Achaemenids are very difficult with the Parthians. And I should say, we don't really have this problem with the art of the other two great Persian empires. The Achaemenids, who their empire exists from the 6th to the 4th century BC, we have imperial capitals such as Persepolis that give us a very good benchmark for the study of Achaemenid art. Likewise, with the Sasanians, the great Persian empire of late antiquity, and actually the ones who put an end to the Parthians, we have these magnificent rock reliefs, which again give us an excellent benchmark for basic aspects of Sasanian art, like style, iconography, that sort of thing. So what do we do when we have two objects like these that are so different? Two Parthian objects that seem to reflect such widely different ideas about form, approaches to verisimilitude, and so forth. How do we find some kind of happy medium in between these objects? And these are not really extremes. Again, these are personal favorites from the Met. We used to call the guy on the right the traffic cop. Now, you can see one way in which scholars have tried to address this problem in the past by looking at Parthian coinage. So here we have a selection of Parthian coins from the earliest, or not quite the earliest, but early to quite late. And you will see that the types are more or less the same. King on the obverse, seated archer on the reverse. But you will see that the style changes considerably, and that we start off with a molded face, admittedly with some abstraction. It's got pretty big eyes and a big nose. But by the time we get to this coin of Vologases III, down on the bottom right there, it's completely linear and stylized. And sort of the old-fashioned explanation for this is that, well, the Parthians were decadent Orientals, and so they lost the ability to make good art. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not very much of one. Recent excavation, and actually not even that recent, has helped to clarify the picture somewhat. One of the Parthian capitals is Old Nisa, up there in the far northeastern part of the empire. And this has actually revealed a wealth of fantastic Parthian art that we can link very closely to the royal court. And this is what it looks like. Again, just a limited sample. The ivory raita, these horn-shaped drinking vessels, are really, really magnificent. But once again, we see that they have what we would normally call a Greek style in the rendering of the figures. And in some cases, we can identify specifically Greek motifs. We get centaurs, for example. And we also have the fragments of sculpture that have been recovered there, again, seem to reflect a Greek approach. So in ways, the material from Old Nisa has not actually helped us with the problem of what is Parthian art, even though it's given us more to work with. My approach is actually to use someone else's approach. My project here is based very much on the work of a quite remarkable scholar, Mikhail Ivanovich Rostovtzeff. He goes by Michael in his English language publications. He was born in what is today Ukraine. It was then part of the Russian Empire. And he studied at Kiev and St. Petersburg, and then taught in St. Petersburg for 20 years before leaving Russia in 1918, for reasons I'm sure you can all guess. After 2 years at Oxford, where he was sort of a guest and apparently quite miserable, he was offered a job by the University of Wisconsin. And the rumor is that he accepted the position and then went to get an atlas to see where Wisconsin was. Apparently he did very well there. The students called him Rough Stuff because they couldn't say his name. And after 5 years in Wisconsin, he moved on to Yale, where he remained for the rest of his career. And it was at Yale that he excavated at the site of Dura-Europos, which will figure prominently in my project here. Rostovtzeff was a remarkable scholar in terms of his breadth. This is a selection, a mere selection of title pages of his books. I have not even included anything that he wrote in Russian in the first 20 years of his career. You will see here that we have books on subjects such as Roman tax farming, Roman lead tokens, Egyptian papyri. Mystic Italy is about mystery cults in Roman Italy. The animal style art, Scythian art more generally. Book on inlaid bronzes of the Han Dynasty, why not? Caravan Cities, which is about the cities of the Syrian desert. And then the books for which he is most famous, at least, well, I would say in general, are the social and economic history of the Roman Empire and the even larger social and economic history of the Hellenistic world, which included one full volume dedicated solely to footnotes. So he's often regarded as kind of the last of the 19th century tradition of sort of ancient world polymaths, and that's somewhat justifiable, I think. His major excavation project was at Dura-Europos, and here he is with his friend and co-director, Franz Cumont, in the Mithraeum at Dura in the 1930s. I should say that most modern archaeologists do not dress this way. Dura is a site, actually, I think I've got a map in the next slide, is a site on the Euphrates in the western part of the Parthian Empire. And as we'll see, in a moment. It's a sort of a border town between the Parthian and Roman worlds. Well, yeah, I'll get to that slide in a moment. You can see here in the aerial view, the walls of the city. The Euphrates River is in the background there. So this was a sort of fortified garrison town, as well as a caravan city. You can also see from this aerial image the orthogonal plan of the town. The blocks are very clearly indicated. You can see that in the plan too. As I said, Dura kind of goes back and forth between various powers. It's founded around 300 by Seleucus, a guy we saw at the beginning, Alexander's general, who takes over the yellow part of the empire. It is captured by the Parthians sometime in the 2nd century. And it remains a Parthian town pretty much until 165. There's a brief interruption when the Romans under Trajan come back into Mesopotamia in force, but they don't stay. And it's only in 165 that it becomes a Roman town for the next 90 years, when it is destroyed by the Sasanians. So it is first and foremost, well, not first, but very much a Parthian town. And I want to emphasize that because Rostovtzeff emphasizes that. But as I'll show you in a moment, many of the scholars working on Dura-Europos today are Roman archaeologists who definitely look at this place from the Mediterranean rather than from the Iranian plateau. Now, Dura has remarkable preservation of all sorts of things, including wall paintings. In fact, it is sometimes called the Pompeii in the desert. So here we have a mural. It's of a man named Conan and his family making an offering in one of Dura's many temples, the Temple of the Palmyrene Gods. I'm just going to give you a few more examples of some of this, some of the fantastic art preserved in Dura. It also has, for example, a Mithraeum, a shrine, well, I guess a temple to the god Mithras, who is seemingly an Iranian god in origin, but whose cult became very popular in the Roman Empire and the Roman army especially. And it was probably introduced to Dura by the Roman garrison there. And so here's the shrine from the Mithraeum as it is reassembled in the Yale University Art Gallery. Many of you may know that Dura has a synagogue, which is also very extensively decorated. Here I've given you an admittedly somewhat grainy picture of the synagogue as reconstructed in the museum in Damascus. And in addition to this, there's a Christian church. It's actually a house that's converted into a church. The wall paintings there are somewhat less stunning, so I haven't put up any, but they are very interesting. And of course, we have many other temples, many other cults, and many other forms of art that go with that. We have, for example, the relief on the left is of the Fortune of Dura with Seleucus and a priest. This is a limestone relief. On the right, we have an inscribed stele of a god named Aflad. And again, you see there's a priest there making an offering in front of him. The The relief on the left has a Palmyrene inscription, which is the form of Aramaic used in Palmyra. We will come back to the relief of Aflad in a bit because I'm using that as an example of how Rostovtzeff approached this material. This is my favorite relief from Dura. This is a relief of a god called Arsu, who you see riding a camel. And of course, Dura is a major caravan city. This is one of the chief stopping points in the caravan trade between Rome and Parthia. I think Arsu looks a lot like Einstein in this relief, which is partly why I like it so much. But again, my point here is to sort of show you the diversity of the material and the cults that we have in Dura. Now, as I said before, traditionally, scholarship on Dura has emphasized its Roman connections. So for example, we have one of the nicest Roman shields was actually excavated at Dura. And you'll see that it's got this wonderful lion at the bottom. And at the top, we have victories crowning an eagle, Roman symbol of a Roman legion. We have Roman, or I should say, Mediterranean gods. Heracles and the Nemean lion there. Kind of looks like he's giving the lion a hug, but he's supposed to be wrestling it. The relief at the top with the goddess with the mural crown. This is something that we see quite frequently in iconography of the Roman East. Recent scholarship has also especially emphasized Dura's connection to Palmyra, which is another caravan city in Syria. So kind of on the, think of it as being into the Roman Empire, although Dura was at various times semi-independent and occasionally fully independent. The two reliefs I've given you there are funerary reliefs that are most definitely from Palmyra. But there's I should say there's a fair bit of scholarship that suggests that the art, much of the art from Dura is actually best understood through a Palmyrene lens, that at Dura they're closely connected to Palmyra. And this is certainly true. They are closely connected to Palmyra. But I would think that it's a somewhat reductive way to approach this material. So Rostovtzeff wrote an essay published in 1935 called Dura and the Problem of Parthian Art. It's 150 pages of text, so it's basically a little book. And in this essay, which he really sets out just to be sort of a preliminary study. I mean, at this time, the Dura-Europos excavations were ongoing. None of the final reports had been published. In fact, even the preliminary reports were several years behind. But in this essay, he makes, I think, a very important set of arguments for our understanding of Parthian art. And I would say these arguments are somewhat difficult to extract from his text because Rostovtzeff was not a theorist. He never discusses method. He never espouses any kind of broader theory. He was very concerned with details. And in fact, much of the historiographic research on Rostovtzeff has been concerned with his methods, especially as an economic historian. Because it is difficult. He was very good at assembling a very large body of material and then getting it all to face in the same direction. So the three major arguments that appear throughout this essay are first, that Parthian art is a cogent phenomenon. So even though I can show you a Rhyton and a relief that are both Parthian but look completely different from each other, in terms of style and technique and content. Rostovtzeff believed that there is, in fact, a cogent phenomenon, that there is an Arsacid royal art that in turn informs what we think of as Parthian art. Second, he is very, well, not very clear, but he clearly believes that style is purposeful. I'll give you an illustration of that in a moment, but what I mean by that is that verisimilitude is not the only objective for an ancient Parthian artist. And that in fact, there are different, the Parthians have different ways of rendering the same subject in the same medium. And that they draw on these different methods, these different manners deliberately to serve specific purposes. And third, rather than trying to sort of track down a single capital, Rostovtzeff believed that art from anywhere in the Parthian Empire is Parthian art, in the sense that it is in dialogue with the art of the Arsacids, and it is in dialogue with the art of the other parts of the empire. It's in dialogue with the art of places outside of the empire too. But essentially what he believed is that you could study Parthian art using what we might think of as provincial art, that you can go around the empire and still get a glimpse at Parthian art. And this justifies his use of it at Dura, to use Dura to study Parthian art. So this is what I mean, especially by style. So here I'm showing you the earliest and latest of those coins that I showed you earlier, which in traditional historiography are considered a decline. As Rostovtzeff points out, it's a change. It's a shift towards a new conception of art. And he makes the very apt comparison with Roman art. Traditionally, Roman art was thought to undergo a decline as we approached late antiquity. And in fact, that was certainly still a current opinion in Rostovtzeff's day, even if it had already been challenged by then. And Rostovtzeff, I think, is very astute in saying that Parthian art arguably should be thought of in the same way, that it is not declining, it is changing. And it is changing for a reason. He's very frank that he doesn't know what that reason is, but that it is purposeful, not just due to artistic failings. So let's have a look at this stela of Offlod, which I showed you earlier. And I'm going to try and use it to talk you through Rostovtzeff's approach as best I can. Because again, he's never explicit about his method. So among the things that he notes in this particular image is that, first of all, the treatment of the body proportions is not in keeping with that of Greek art. And in fact, it is much more in keeping with that of the Achaemenids, the earlier Persian Empire. You'll see the sort of big head and short body is something that characterizes Achaemenid art as well. He also draws a comparison between the depiction of Offlod and some of the coin images of Parthian kings, focusing on, for example, the neck torques, the rendering of the hair as a series of rounded curls that then have straight lines going up behind them, and so forth. He uses far more examples than this. He also draws a comparison with rock reliefs in the Parthian Empire, and there are a few, and in particular with this sort of frontal presentation of the human form. Now, this is something that exists in Greek art. It exists in earlier Mesopotamian art, but it is not very common in either. And here at Dura, we see a lot of it. And then he goes on to argue that in these later images, so this is that painting of the sacrifice of Conan, which I showed you earlier, this dates to the period of Roman rule in Dura. Rostovtzeff argues that this presentation of the figures in this relief is actually still following a Parthian artistic tradition as it is represented at Dura. And part of the reason why I've showed this to you is because you can see in comparing the figures of the priests with the pointed hats, they're compositionally very similar if we allow for differences in the media. And like I said, this is just a single example of how Rostovtzeff tries to sort of recover Parthian art from the material at Dura. His overall vision can be schematized somewhat like this, in that, yes, Parthian art, we don't really have it in the form of dynastic art, but sort of like a black hole, we can see it because of how it affects other things. And so we can see it in Palmyra, in Dura-Europos. We can see it, he argues, in Gandharan art. And he is sure it must exist. So my project is geared towards creating a new edition of Rostovtzeff's essay that includes, in addition to some notes that help sort out the mess that is his bibliography, new chapters on both Parthian art, how that has changed in 90 years, as well as on Dura-Europos. But my focus here this fall is on the introduction, which is really getting into Rostovtzeff himself. And I should say I've been at it for about 2 weeks, so don't ask any really hard questions. And I'm focusing on Rostovtzeff's life, how he is as an art historian as opposed to an economic historian, and really on how he is involved in Parthian art. But I am convinced that he is right when he characterizes Parthian art as a revival of Iranian art, in the sense that it was deliberately moving away from Greek style, Greek motifs, and Greek practices. And I categorically agree with this statement, except of course for words like Oriental. But I think that he's absolutely right that Parthian art is this sort of, is dynamic and really transforms ancient Iranian art. And so it's a really key chapter in the history of ancient Iran. Thank you. Absolutely. Yes.
Hi. Thanks. That was really interesting. I don't know much about Parthian art, but I wonder, is this the kind of thing where once you, it seems to me that I'm not sure whether you really want Parthian art to be a thing or not. In other words, like, where do you stand on this question?
Absolutely. It's definitely a thing. There's no doubt in my mind. But like everyone else studying Parthian art, I'm still finding it hard to yeah. Yes.
Thank you. It really was very interesting. It's always nice to see these old photos from Dura-Europos. I wonder, you are talking about Parthian as a culture, right?
To an extent.
To an extent. Parthia as a phenomenon that is also cultural. Therefore, we have art, right? But the question is, it is defined according to political maneuvers, that is to say war, conquest. And the thing that defines it is actually style. in terms of the material artifacts. And so I wonder if it's on one hand stands as a culture that is based on Alexandrian conquest or a post-Alexandrian conquest moment. And on the other, it is based on some revival of Greek style. To what extent can we actually define it as culture, and to what extent we should look in other things that define it as culture? Let's say technology, because style is a form of technology, science, ways in which people do sacrifice, other nodes that in this very, very rich network that we call culture.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. And this is actually this big question that we face in any study of ancient art. So you can ask the exact same question of the Roman Empire. What is Roman art? Well, Otto Brendel says it's art anywhere in the Roman Empire. But if the Romans cross a river in Germany and make camp for a week, is the art from that place Roman art, especially if they leave again? I mean, you see, it points directly to that issue you raised, that these are political boundaries established by military means, and that is not completely separate, but operates very differently than, say, cultural forces. You know, in many cases, Rostovtzeff actually uses examples from what he calls South Russia, so Ukraine and steppe region, which we can't really necessarily stick into the Parthian Empire. We don't have a clear kind of political justification. But on the other hand, we really don't have any of the sources we need to sort of draw any kind of political boundary of the Parthian Empire. So I really don't have an answer to your question other than to say that I challenge anyone who studies ancient art to have an answer to your question.
But therein lies the question. I mean, I'm sorry to put you. We do know that there is Roman art in India, in South Asia. We call it Roman art. And the question is whether you're trying to define what is Parthia as an empire or what is Parthian art.
I'm trying to define what is Parthian art.
So why so rely on a geographical definition rather than artistic definition?
Well, I don't rely solely on a geographic definition.
Okay.
And if I did, I would, as I said, the geographic definition is so unclear and porous as to be unhelpful. But you're absolutely right in asking that question. Like this gets at the fundamental difficulty of this material, and it's even more difficult with the Parthians than it is with other ancient empires.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's really fascinating.
If I could just jump in on Itai's question, because I think in a way, you had two different slides or two different points that in a way are internally contradictory. And I think that's what Itai is pointing at. On the one hand, you're saying Parthian art is wherever the Parthian flag was planted, so to speak. But then you had that slide just before, which was a little bit like the creation of Indo-European. You showed all of the peripheral places, that one, right? And you want to extrapolate for what a theoretical Parthian art would have to be such that it would have these 6 manifestations. And I think those two positions are in conflict.
Well, I should point out that this is not a systematic diagram. This is an example. This is sort of well, first of all, this was a product of late last night. And second, this is just sort of my attempt to kind of render in a visual manner Rostovtzeff's approach. And I agree that it's crude. The point about Parthian art is the art in the empire, is that, I guess I should explain that statement a little more, because that is pushing back against this idea that we have to find a Parthian homeland and a Parthian capital, and that is where Parthian art resides. And the idea that I think is so powerful in Rostovtzeff is that, no, we don't. We can study it from how it affects other artistic traditions in the empire.
Before the next question, so it's a center periphery point?
Among others, yes.
So maybe there's no center.
Well, there is a center, we just don't know what it is.
But with that in mind, maybe if we go back to the quote which you showed at the very end, and one thing which sort of worried me about Rostovtzeff is he may not have geographical cores in mind, but he does have these ideas, and it goes towards ethnocentric kind of essentialism. And you have it very clearly spelled out there: national Iranian reaction against Greek art. And that is something that looks very familiar to me, to what I studied, how Rostovtzeff explained Northern Black Sea art. And I always think of, Itai was pointing out that we should be looking at other cultural practices behind the art, but for Rostovtzeff, those cultural practices were actually, at the end of the day, always religion. And I'm maybe with that in mind, have you figured out where Rostovtzeff places Parthia within the broader ancient world as a conduit between East and West, and you sort of his ideas of religious history?
Yeah, this is a funny question to me, because I found recently a publication of a letter that Rostovtzeff wrote to a Japanese scholar that was sort of a biography in response to a request from that scholar. And one of the things he said in it was actually that he regarded South Russia as a little Parthia. And so it should worry you even more that he's kind of seeing it in this sort of direct, he sees Russia as this kind of direct successor to, the Parthians, among other people. I think it's certainly true that he engages in essentialism. He's definitely reducing Iranian art into some kind of stereotyped features. On the other hand, he is at least giving us a framework that we can use, and we can test these ideas. I'm not claiming that he's right in his details, and I think that, well, it's pretty clear if you read, say, the social and economic history of the Hellenistic world, that there's a lot of Orientalist stereotyping going on in there. He sort of sets up a lot of that as the sort of a clash between civilization and barbarism, in which barbarism ultimately wins. And I agree with you that art, or that religion, is frequently the factor underlying his approach. But again, I'm trying to use the framework that he builds, and not necessarily what he does with it. I think it's the framework that's valuable, and that we can use it to help address some of these basic questions about Parthian art.
I think you're getting into something that's really, really, really interesting. And I don't know if you ever read Tom Matthews' The Clash of Gods.
A long time ago.
No, exactly. So Matthews begins the book, which was very highly controversial book back in the day when it was published, right? With the death of empire, right? Andrei Grabar losing his seat and going to exile. What's his name? The Romanist losing his seat and going to exile. And I think the third one was Kitzinger, who had to fled Munich and go to London and then to the US. And I think Roscoe is also suffering exactly from the same thing, right? He lost his empire, and now he's constantly looking for an empire from Madison, Wisconsin, and then from Yale, right? As this constant looking for a geographical place that did not necessarily exist as a physical thing. Right, as kind of which is a typical refugee problem, right? You always want to have something to long for, even if that something doesn't really exist.
Well, and you'll see an argument to that effect made by the scholars who study Rostovtzeff as an economic historian. They definitely see that there is a lot of imperial Russia, right, in his Roman Empire, and in fact, there are times when he first came to the US, when he gave lectures where he actually drew clear lines to that fact. That he made it very clear that there was a direct sort of connection that the ancient problems of, say, land tenure have direct ramifications in the present day, and points to Russia.
To what extent Parthian was a problem when he was in Europe? To what extent this was actually a living question among archaeologists when he was in Europe?
Well, that's difficult because there's very little scholarship, sustained scholarship on ancient Iranian art in the early 20th century. And you have things like, you have the travel logs, but Herzfeld is only going to Iran before World War I believe. And you don't have sort of synthetic treatments until Survey of Persian Art in the 30s, which includes Parthian art, but it's actually in many ways Rostovtzeff is he's not dealing with a vacuum, because there is he's responding to a problem of Parthian art, but it's not really, there isn't sort of a big scholarly apparatus that he's fighting over this. He even he doesn't actually cite with whom he's disagreeing in the beginning of this article. He says, I do not know who was the first to formulate this idea. Yeah.
One else, but this actually just brings me sort of his way of not mentioning his own intellectual genealogy, which left people wondering ever since, who actually taught him and where he came from. But the one thing which you mentioned before in your summary of the Parthian art essay, as style as being intentional, that really made me listen up, because that's something he never wrote about in the 20s in his earlier work, which is sort of what he wrote in Russia and then earlier on in the US and in the UK. Is there any reference to where they came from? There is Riegel and Strigovsky, which he never mentioned in his published works. In his letters, he actually, in some places, says that Strigovsky plagiarized him.
Interesting.
Is he more open in the 1935 essay?
No,
nothing at all.
It's really like, this is part of what's maddening about it. It's that it's presented solely in empirical terms. He is building up an accumulation of material from which the pattern emerges to his uniquely well-trained eye. There's no citation of anything that's really not an excavation report or something else.
In the meantime, the chat has been versatile, so I want to give some time for those watching elsewhere. So there are a couple of different groups of questions. I'll try and group some together. Judith Lerner asks, what's the difference between Parthian art and art of the Parthian period? So time-space question. And similarly, Ivan Gaskell asks, if you were trying to define Parthian art, then what is Parthian non-art, i.e. material things associated with the Parthian Empire that by some measure or measures do not qualify as art? And so take that, and then I have some other questions to group together.
Well, to some extent, all of us, as art historians, must recognize that there's that these sort of firm definitions of what is and is not Roman art, for example, or Parthian art, ultimately become meaningless. I think that to some extent, we only ever come up with a working definition. And it's not because the goal isn't to say, this is Parthian art and this isn't. The goal is to say something about the Parthians. The goal is to try and understand, well, my usual goal, for example, in studying Achaemenid art is always trying to understand how does Achaemenid rule affect the people living in this part of the empire? And so my goal in trying to understand Parthian art is to first try and understand the Parthians in some basic way, but then more generally to understand, to try and examine that interaction that you see in the art that's produced around the empire. And that's my goal, really. It's not to try and create a definition. What I want to do is to, how do I put this? Yeah, I really want a working definition of Parthian art, something that serves the needs of scholarship without getting, well, honestly, without getting too bogged down in details. And so that distinction between Parthian art and art in the Parthian Empire, I don't think that's a distinction. It's more of a spectrum. And that it's something that you really need to take on a case-by-case basis. I mean, if you look at Achaemenid art in Egypt, for example, there's a famous statue of King Darius made in Egypt. But it is, it utilizes Egyptian sculptural techniques. It has hieroglyphic inscriptions. It is a monument of an Egyptian pharaoh. At the same time, it utilizes Achaemenid royal ideology. So it is a image of a Persian king. It's not 50-50. It's not 75-25. It's both. And that's an object where if you get into a discussion of is it Achaemenid art or isn't it, you'll find that it's not a useful discussion. And that's kind of how I feel about discussions of is it Parthian art or isn't it?
We've already anticipated the next grouping of questions, which is also comparative, but not, but looking at the relationship, as you'll hear. So Rin came from, I saw across the park. Is there evidence of the Arsacids engaging with standing Achaemenid monuments comparable to the Sasanians engaging with Achaemenid art at Naksh and Rustam? And then also David Castriota asking if what the Parthians are doing, according to you, in terms of a national Iranian revival versus the Hellenistic style, anticipates the Sasanian revival of Achaemenid dynastic tradition and royal religious ideology.
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. And I once again want to remind everyone that I'm 2 weeks into this project. There is relatively little sort of direct evidence of Parthian engagement with Achaemenid monuments. I mean, there's some sort of indication of, say, there are some reliefs that are near Achaemenid reliefs, near Achaemenid monuments, but nothing like what you see with the Sasanians, where they carve their some of their most prominent reliefs are carved right beneath the rock reliefs of the Achaemenid royal tombs. So you don't have anything that's quite that overt. I do think that Parthian royal ideology does incorporate a significant amount of Achaemenid royal ideology, but that's sort of it's kind of a working theory. It's kind of an art historian's instinct, and not something that I can necessarily prove or articulate at this point. And then about the revival, the comparison with the Sasanians is very interesting, because the Sasanians are very clearly going in another direction. Like Sasanian royal art is very, for lack of a better term, strong. You know, you can identify it pretty clearly, and it is certainly. I'm not sure. Well, actually, one of the more interesting developments is that Matthew Canepa has recently argued in a very thick and very interesting book called The Iranian Expanse, that the Sasanians are actually kind of wiping the memory of the Parthians out. You know, so one of the comments that Rostovtzeff astutely makes is that we don't have Parthian palaces because the Sasanians knocked them all over and built palaces on top of them. That seems to be true. And the Sasanians are actually really trying to not so much make themselves into a new Achaemenid empire, but they're very much forging an imperial identity that is focused on Iran and not sort of drawing on any other source of charismatic authority. Whereas the Parthians, I think, draw on Greek sources and on Iranian sources. And this is partly why the Sasanians don't set themselves up as the successors to the Parthians. And I wonder if the transition that Rostovtzeff sees in the rendering of Parthian art actually has to do with the Parthians making an adjustment of that sort for themselves. But again, that's still all in the realm of working theory.
So I think we've come to the end for today. I want to thank you very much, Henry. And for those watching far, we'll be back here tomorrow, same time, for Stephen Nelson, Dean of the Center for the Advanced Study of Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Washington, speaking to us in this conversation series. Thank you. Good day.